Morning. I'm Steve Stanley. I'm with the Racial Equity Council here at Fourth Church, and I am very happy and proud to introduce to you Jack Macnamara, who is with us today. We're having a lesson in Chicago's history, and since I read this book, Family Matters, Family Properties, 10 years ago, Jack was an inspiration and a hero of mine. This is Jack up here. He was the lead organizer for the Contract Buyers League for African American families that were, you'll hear more about the story. It's a history of Chicago that we don't hear much about, but families that were redlined and deprived financial services and had to buy on contract, buy homes without any of the opportunities and rights of homeowners. So anyway, we're going to hear that story, but Jack is with us today. He graduated from Loyola Academy and received a bachelor's and master's from Loyola University. A Jesuit scholastic, he taught Latin and Greek at St. Xavier High School in Cincinnati. He was the chief organizer for the Contract Buyers League. The Contract Buyers League initiated 2 federal lawsuits and conducted a payment strike in which each family purchased monthly money orders in the amount of the contract payment and brought the money order to the Contract Buyers League office for placement in a safety deposit box. As a result, 450 families got their contracts renegotiated with an average savings per family of $13,500. You'll hear more about this story, this history. Jack went on in his life. For 33 years, he owned and operated Fred Bush Foods Corporation, a sausage manufacturing firm. Among other things, he served as chairman of the school board of St. Francis Xavier in Wilmette, on the board of trustees at Loyola Academy, and as a founding chairperson of the Chicago Archdiocesan Pastoral Council. He also served on the advisory committee and directed the feasibility study for Christ the King Jesuit College Prep School, which opened in 2008 in the Austin neighborhood. He also served on the board of trustees at Christ the King and was its first chief financial officer. He was appointed a visiting scholar at the Loyola University Center for Urban Research and Learning. He currently serves on the board of directors of Austin Coming Together. We're also privileged to welcome his wife Peggy with us today. She is an artist in residence at the Field Museum in Chicago. Peggy and Jack have 7 grown children and 21 grandchildren. Wow, at last count. Welcome, Jack Macnamara.
Don't let that visiting scholar at Loyola University confuse you. Actually, what it means is you don't get paid. I'm really honored to be speaking at your symposium here today, and its apt name of Chicago Segregation in the Church. And that's because, in part, social injustice has seemed to me to be of inferior importance in the life of the church. And I use church in the very broad sense, including all of us. And my concern about social justice began to develop in high school when I felt that the church overemphasized sins of the flesh and other individual sins and seriously underemphasized collective social, cultural, and structural sinfulness in society. When it came to write a thesis for a master's in philosophy, I found myself choosing the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, whose Moral Man and Immoral Society is among his most noted works. Most would agree that it was during slavery that the dominant U.S. culture plundered the African community most blatantly, most intensely, and most cruelly. I submit that more recently, it is the housing market, not only the rental market, but most especially in the so-called home ownership market, that the dominant culture in the United States has legally but unjustly extracted the most money from the African American community post-slavery. If you look at the contract buyers league race tax chart that was among the handouts, you will see that the extraction of wealth went beyond the reasonable and unjust markup over the close to market value price extracted by the selling speculators, but also included interest because the contract buyers were paying excessive interest because of the inflated sales price. And so as the average goes for the first 20 families that we did the research on back in 1967, you can see that it was an average of over $20,000 per family that it cost them to own a home than it did if they had been white. And when I saw the $418,000 total, which I hadn't totaled up before, but when I put it on an Excel spreadsheet, I found that it was easy to make the totals. And I saw $418,000, and it struck me that that's a lot of money, even in 2018, $13. And I became obsessed with the idea of trying to find out how much was legally stolen from the African American community during the Second Great Migration, 1940 to 1970. And that research was finally done in the summer of 2018, and we presented our findings at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, and of course there's a handout available of the findings from that. It's a much longer piece than a two-sided piece, but Allison will be happy to email them to you if you don't get a copy today, and because she didn't want to make two copies and have the paper go to waste. In addition to the hardships of an inflated selling price and excessive interest, a third denial was placed on contract buyers because it also denied them the opportunity to grow wealth that was available to low-income white American homeowners, and was what actually grew the white middle class. Although other groups were victims of unjust housing practices, the injustices done to the African American community were generally the most expansive, the most intense, and the most cruel. In the order of gravity, the African Americans, after African Americans, are Latinx people, Asians, and even poor whites. In Chapter 4 of Upton Sinclair's 1904 novel, The Jungle, the story is told of contract selling in the Lithuanian, Polish, and German communities of Chicago around the stockyards. But none of the others, whether it was during the contract buying period or during the subprime housing period, were subjected to the kind of an extent of the hardship that black people were subjected to. For the purposes here, there are three time periods for legal but unjust extraction of wealth. African Americans and other communities of color suffered this during the Second Great Migration, the subprime mortgage period, and then since the subprime mortgage crisis, the federal government has been selling homes, foreclosed homes, to the African American community, to the Wall Street type speculators who are trying to sell them in the African American communities. I don't think that has gone as well for them as they hoped. And I hope that's the case. But anyway, that's part of the story. Ta-Nehisi Coates was introduced to contract selling by Burl Satter's book. And he first wrote a blog that had a title that I thought was excellent, "The Ghetto is Public Policy." And then he called Burl to ask her to introduce him to some of the contract buyers, and she put him in touch with me, and we worked pretty hard together in taking him around to contract buyers, and 3 of the contract buyers ended up being a central feature of his article. And those 2 events, the Burl Satter book and Ta-Nehisi Coates, have been really instrumental in expanding the awareness. I mean, it's still one of the best kept secrets, but today there's a much more awareness of contract selling and its negatives than there was 50 years ago when we were messing around on the west side and south side with contract selling. The research for the presentation at the Federal Reserve Bank on May 30th, 2019 was conducted mostly in the summer of 2018 with 10 graduate students and upper-level college students from Howard University, Duke University, Roosevelt University, and UIC, and Loyola University of Chicago. The majority of these students were minority students, and one of them was going to be here today. I don't see her, but she was one from Duke University. The research was gathered at the County Recorder of Deeds, where we got a lot of help from Karen Yarborough, the current Cook County clerk, who set us up with a special room and instructed her staff to be helpful to us as we conducted this research. In fact, she had read Family Properties and had her executive staff read it as well, and then they discussed it chapter by chapter on a monthly basis as they went through it. And there was, great support from her. And then also at the National Archives out by Daly College on South Pulaski, and also at the law offices of Jenner and Block, who filed 2 federal lawsuits, both of which were lost. And I think they could be won today, but they were lost. But they also put in 15 years, and had we been charged, it would have been well over $1 million in them filing those lawsuits. The 3 major findings of the research that we did in the summer of 2018 were that between $3.2 billion and $4 billion was legally stolen from the African American community. The 3.2 to 4 billion is, we've adjusted that for inflation. Individual families ended up spending to own a home more than $71,000, more than they would have if they were white. So the individual family horror was pretty substantial, and that also is in today's dollars. One of the things that we also discovered, and we've got to do a little bit more research on this, but I'm reasonably sure that it's fairly accurate, is that 83% of the 50,000 black families that bought homes on contract during this period, 1950 to 1970, paid their contracts in full and on time. This is an extraordinary number given the onerous terms of the contract. For example, the average contract buyer paid $77.10 more for the homes that they would have paid if they were white. The average down payment for a black contract buyer was $1,085 and only $415 for a white FHA mortgager. The average length of a black contract buyer's contract was 18 years, as opposed to the average length of a FHA mortgager's contract or loan of 25 to 30 years. The average monthly payment for a black contract buyer was $260 a month versus $85 to $105 a month for the average white FHA mortgager. The difference, or the reason there's two figures there, some of the contracts or the mortgages were 25 years and others were 30 years. So, but the difference between what a contract buyer was paying per month and what, yes, sir.
Yeah, so the overpayment was almost always related to the financing, right, not to the price of the home.
Well, the price of the home, if it's $7,700 more than you would have paid if you were white,
But the $7,700 is interest cost, isn't it?
no, 700 is the inflated sales price.
It's like double, wouldn't it? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, if you'll notice on that sheet, the sellers, the speculators, paid actually close to market value. Maybe they took a hit for 1,000. The white outgoing families took a hit for 1,000, but then they turn around a few days later and sell it to a black family for 10,000 more than they paid for it. And because they were paying on a highly inflated principal interest, the interest issue wasn't, for us, it wasn't that big a deal. Most of the interest was charged at 7%, or a lot of the interest, which was the maximum allowed by Illinois law during that entire time period. And most white mortgages were paying 6%. There's a difference which is significant over the period, but the most significant difference was the highly inflated sales price to begin with and the interest that they paid because of the highly extra interest they paid, not because of a high rate, but because of the highly inflated sales price. The facts stated above and other data contained in the report present a recurrence of present with a current recurrence of contract selling and the government for selling foreclosed homes to Wall Street type speculators, as I just mentioned. As I mentioned earlier, Ta-Nehisi Coates was introduced to contract selling when he read Family Properties. And it was when he published his article in the Atlantic in June of 2014. He got a call from his mother the next day telling him that the house that his grandmother owned in Baltimore had been bought on contract. So he didn't realize that his own family had been a victim when he was writing the article that got so much attention back in 2014. The college student researchers engaged in this project and some of their mentors believe that it is not sufficient to conclude the effort with the symposium at the Federal Reserve Bank on May 30th of last year. Work is proceeding on an ambitious effort we are calling Restitution Homes. Restitution Homes is grounded on the belief that affordable housing is a virtually meaningless phrase because its meaning varies from real estate developer to real estate developer, from politician to politician, from urban planner to urban planner, etc. But when a poor person, and particularly a black person, goes to a lending institution for a mortgage, she and or he are told that the amount of their monthly payment cannot exceed 25% of their monthly income for principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. There's some argument between whether 25 or 30%, which is not one that I want to discuss right now. So the 25% is a pretty good rule of thumb. For all these home buyers, the mortgage payment of 25% of their monthly income is what really defines affordable housing. They can't have a mortgage that exceeds that amount. It is with this understanding of affordable housing that Restitution Homes proposes that home buyers get a mortgage commitment assisted by Restitution Homes, and that Restitution Homes provide a restitution voucher to make up the difference, or cover the difference between the mortgage commitment and the selling price. Therefore, if somebody, with all certain qualifications is interested in buying a house, we would work with them to get a mortgage, and in addition, have a restitution fund that would provide a restitution voucher to cover the difference between the mortgage and the selling price of the house. So in some cases, that could be as much as $50,000, $60,000, $70,000, but not out of line with what has been already stolen from their ancestors in connection with this sort of thing. So what will Restitution Homes do, among other things, when still in the planning process? But first, it will assist home buyers in working with a real estate broker and or contractor for purposes of planning the purchase, and then working with a lending institution for the purpose of getting a mortgage. Second, Restitution Homes will develop and manage a $1 billion plus restitution fund. In the process of building the $1 billion restitution fund, and by the way, I get laughed at in a lot of places when I talk about a $1 billion restitution fund, which I personally don't think is impossible. Rather, it's an imperative that we do this if we're going to be true to what we should be as Americans, as churchgoers, as religious people, etc. Restitution Homes will be seeking government participation because the government at the federal, state, and local levels created the conditions for predatory contract selling to occur. And this is all really well spelled out by Burl Satter in great detail in her book, Family Properties. And it's, I don't have time here to go through the list of them, other than to say that one of the biggest culprits was the FHA and the policies that they created, which excluded. And it's even upsetting that somebody as we admire as much as President Roosevelt caved to the Southern Democrats in order to get something passed when it came to the beginning of the FHA, simply because the Southern Democrats at that time were completely opposed to having black people be able to take advantage of the mortgages. Locally, the urban renewal projects, et cetera, were, as Beryl points out, filled with all kinds of shenanigans that shouldn't have been going on. Banks and savings and loan institutions and other corporate entities and individual American citizens also contributed to this exploitation and oppression. Therefore, restitution homes will be seeking corporate and individual contributions, foundation contributions, etc. And inasmuch as churches and educational institutions have been silent with respect to predatory practices, it is appropriate that they too be solicited for participation. We strongly believe that funds donated to and earned by billion-dollar restitution fund be kept separately and used only for restitution vouchers described above, with no money from that fund being used for administrative or operating expenses. We are investigating the possibility of having the operations housed in one of the new L3C low-profit limited liability corporations that receives money both as investments and as tax-deductible donations. So, and the reason for that is that we'd like to make sure that at least part of the operating expenses are somewhat self-sustainable so that we don't have to be knocking on doors every day of the week most of our time to be raising the money for this. A word about the church and commitment to structural social transformation. And here I'm going to tell a remarkable story of the Jesuits and what they did 50 years ago when it came to the issue of the Forcible Entry and Detainer Act in Illinois that had a provision in it that all that the seller or landlord, in case of renters, had to do was that a contract buyer or a renter was behind in their payments and that no defenses could be raised. And that struck me as being pretty contrary to what I had been taught about American policy as early as grammar school. And there was also another ugly provision in the Forcible Entry and Detainer Act that you had to post an appeal bond of a year's payments, and none of the contract buyers there could post $260 a month payments as an appeal bond. So we were trying to raise an appeal bond fund, and one night when we had people from the Jesuit provincial residents over for dinner, the provincial being the top dog in the Chicago province, which covered a portion of the Midwest at that time. The provincial, Father Harbeneck, used to always come in and try to sit when he came to the house, our place for dinner, sit with the contract buyers who were there, and was very much impressed with them. And that night after they went home, I had never made an appeal to Father Harbeneck about getting money for an appeal bond, But when they got home, his assistant called me and said that Harbenek was going to sign a thing the next morning saying that the Jesuits of the Chicago province were going to put up $100,000 for an appeal bond. And I thought I died and went to heaven. And it was because the contract buyers had talked about it, and he was moved by it, et cetera. A month or two later, all 10 American provincials were meeting in Chicago. I don't know where I got the nerve to do this, but I called Father Harbenek and asked him if they would want to come for dinner. And he said, his response was, I don't know, but I'll ask them. And the 10 provincials came for dinner. They came and listened to presentations by the contract buyers, by the college students, by Tom Ferran, who is the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Illinois, and Gordon Sherman, who has been was the founder of Midas Muffler. Subsequently, the other 9 provinces of the Jesuits contributed or put up another $150,000 for the appeal bond, and we ended up having $250,000 of Jesuit money posted so that these cases could be tried. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of our complaints, and the appeal bond was released. When I addressed a group of Jesuit directors of social activities for the 27 current Jesuit colleges and universities and 6 American and Canadian provinces in September of 2019, I said, I hope that the Holy Spirit might be inclined to move the Jesuits to help restitution homes in a similar way, which in today's, their $250,000 back in 1970 amounts to close to $2 million today. I haven't heard yet from them. But one of them encouraged me to keep going at it. So anyway, the mood is in some places there. What we are trying to do is focus on housing in Chicago. Two minutes.
We'll have you come back.
Anyway, the idea behind restitution homes, as you can tell, is basically an idea of reparations. We decided to use restitution and reparations both, not because we're afraid to use reparations, but because we think that restitution has more of a connotation of paying back money that has been stolen as opposed to the word reparations. That's clearly what we're about. Now, I'll have to abbreviate this, but we're hoping that people like people in this group, some of the people like people in this group, would be willing or interested in helping us out. Of course, contributions to the $1 billion restitution fund or introductions to people who might be, or institutions that might be interested in doing this sort of thing. We also need help in designing the regulations and the things. We need a mixed group of people to help us put together the rules for paying the restitution vouchers, and we need help in trying to put together an L3C corporation, and we've got to start on that with a lawyer in Chicago named Mark Lane, whom I heard talk at Loyola University School of Business, and we met with him in December, and he's the one who drafted the L3C legislation in Illinois, and he when we met with him, he says, most of what I get involved in is businesses which are trying to do some social good. He says, but what you're talking about here is transformative. It will revitalize and reorganize the city. And so it's in this area we don't have the answers, but we need help from people like you who would be willing to do it. And on the race tax chart and the executive summary of restitution homes, I have put my telephone number and my email address. And by way of closing, let me thank you for your kind attention. As I said, it's been an honor to be here, and I look forward to coming back.
Couple of things. First, I'll just warn you that this clock is 5 minutes fast. And secondly, I've been asked to introduce our next speaker, who is Nedra Sims-Fears. Nedra is a longtime part of the Fourth Presbyterian community here. She's also a member of the Racial Equity Council. And currently, Nedra is the executive director of the Greater Chatham Initiative. The Greater Chatham Initiative is a new economic development nonprofit that creates a comprehensive action plan for economic growth and neighborhood vitality. So please join me in welcoming Nedra.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here, and I'm just going to give a kind of brief overview of some of the history of Greater Chatham, the church history, the influence that it has had in Chicago. And so again, my name is Nedra Sims-Fears. I've been a member here and for a long time. I married my wonderful husband here about 27 years ago, and I've been and I grew up in Greater Chatham. So that I want to thank Jack for his excellent presentation, and I live and was reared in Chatham, one of the communities that was affected by the predatory lending. And so Greater Chatham is part of 4 neighborhoods on the south side. You can see this is a map of the city of Chicago. The city of Chicago has 77 neighborhoods, and I work in 4 of the neighborhoods, Chatham, Avalon Park, Auburn, Gresham, and Greater Grand Crossing. Those neighborhoods basically are just a little south and west of Hyde Park. It starts at 67th Street on the north, goes to 95th Street on the south. The eastern boundary is South Chicago, and the western boundary is the Dan Ryan Woods. It consists of about 122,000 people, 44,000 households. Any place else but the city of Chicago, it would be a mid-sized city. Let's see. Okay, I can do that. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the history of Greater Chatham, but first I'm going to talk about kind of Chicago's Black Belt, and that my parents were part of the Great Migration. The first wave of the Great Migration happened in the 1910, 1930s. My grandparents came up from Mississippi in the 1910 to get rid of kind of Jim Crow, and they moved to Joliet, Illinois, had my father, Osborne Sims, and my mother came in the 1940s, so she was part of the second industrial wave. And over here is a map of the city of Chicago in 1947, and the darker areas really consist of kind of this black belt, which is right here. And so it was a very small, self-contained area. I want to say started around 18th Street, went to 47, 55th Street, and went from the Dan Ryan over to the lake. And so that is where the black population stayed, lived, and could not go anyplace else because with the segregation, and particularly with the racial restrictive covenants, having had the opportunity to buy several homes, it is really shocking based on current sensibilities to look at your deed and to see in your deed covenants in the 40s and 50s that says no Jews or blacks could live here. And so it was because of those racial covenants that black people really were confined in a very discrete area, and it was overcrowded. My mother talks about living in the basement apartment, very overcrowded. And so when the Supreme Court struck down the covenant in 1947, the black population was able to migrate. And that was a good thing, but it also led to the history of redlining, panic peddling, and the wholesale turnover of communities. And so my parents were part of that. My mother married my father. He was a police officer. Unfortunately, he was killed in the line of duty when I was an infant in 1956, full disclosure. And so my mother bought our home, which is the Georgian, which is our family home now at 82nd and Calumet, and that I was really surprised to learn that about the contract buying, because my mother actually had a mortgage, and I didn't realize how unusual it was for a black woman who was a widow, to have a mortgage. And so I asked my mother, how did that occur? And it occurred because at my father's burial, Mayor Daley said, "Is there anything that I can do for you, for your fallen police officer? Give me a call." My mother called Mayor Daley and said, "I needed a mortgage," and she got a mortgage from First Federal. So it was, we were one of the lucky ones with connection, with power, influence to get a mortgage. And I can see my mother paid off the mortgage. We have the mortgage and the deed, but it is a testimony of power and connections of that. And this is my kind of current family, and this is my mother over here, who had the grit and the determination to go and get a mortgage and make sure that we had a better life. So I'm going to briefly go through the kind of the history of the African American history of Greater Chatham. It was started kind of in 1836. It was always it was called the Mud Flats. When I look at historical pictures of the area, it looks like a pond. The water didn't churn. It was basically mud, and so you could see ducks and geese. And I remember walking to school as a child, seeing ponds, and so that was a challenge. The neighborhood was residentially mature, quote unquote. Everything was built by the 20s and 30s. It was settled by basically Hungarian, Swedes, and Irish, and that. But there were blacks who lived along the fringes of the community, and I'm going to highlight two of them. One is Thomas Dorsey. He is the father of gospel, and he lived in the community, and he literally literally created gospel as a fusion of jazz and historic religious music, and it was very controversial at the time. And his protege was Mahalia Jackson, who lived around the corner. She was our resident celebrity at the time, and she was known as a very famous gospel singer, and she was also a colleague of Dr. Martin Luther King. She was the one who said at the March on Washington that King had in the 60s, told King to tell people about the dream. And so she was a very prominent, active civil rights member. Along with her was Lorraine Hansberry. She's the picture over there. It says 1959, and she wrote Raisin in the Sun. And Raisin in the Sun was the first Pulitzer Prize-winning play on Broadway that was done by African-American women, and it is a reflection of her family. The plot of Raisin in the Sun are people leaving the Black Belt, going for a better opportunity living in the Chatham community. And so she wrote about her experience. I would say that I grew up in an idyllic childhood. I didn't realize it at the time. In the 1950s, Chatham went from being 1% Black to 1960, it was 87% Black. Even though with the restricted covenants, the suburbs were pretty closed to African Americans, so we lived all in one place. And in my block, my mother was a teacher. My mother married my stepfather. He was a foreman at Ford. We had a judge down the street. We had an accountant next door. We had a postal worker. It was a kind of a melting pot. And one of my friends likes to say he found that it was the land of teachers. Everybody's mother was a teacher, it seemed. And it was a very tight-knit, social, cohesive community. And if you did something at school, by the time you got home, everyone knew about it. So it was a very tight-knit community. So when one of the things that I love about the community, the history, is that it is a very strong history of churches. I grew up in the Creole Presbyterian Church. There's a couple of Presbyterian churches that are predominantly African American on the south side, and that the churches, when the community to the north of us, which is Greater Grand Boulevard, was segregated, it was a lot of racial tension and fighting, and that there were riots in the parks, there were homes set on fire. It was a very ugly precedent. And so when the neighborhood immediately south of that, which was Chatham, was integrated, the ministers got together and said, we do not want a replication of this in Chatham. And so they decided to do managed integration. They formed the Chatham Avalon Community Organization, which was comprised of an umbrella organization of churches and community groups and block clubs. They invited at that time it was predominantly white. They invited the African Americans in, and they sat and they had kind of the orderly transition. The neighborhood still rapidly changed from black to white, from white to black, but it was done in an orderly way, and it was no violence. And so I'm really very proud of the history of the religious leaders at the time managing integration in a constructive way. So I want to talk about, so we have George Jackson, I always get confused, the Johnsons, who built Ultra Sheen, which is an African-American hair products place. And he was instrumental. He was the first African-American company to be listed on the American Stock Exchange. He was very wealthy. He used his wealth. He underwrote the Black popular soul train dance dance show that I grew up watching in the 60s and 70s. But he also was influential in helping to start three of our black banks at the time: Seaway National Bank, Independence Bank, and blanking out on the third one. But that was important because Martin Luther King came to Chicago not only because of the racial segregation and justice, but also because the black banks were here. We had a very affluent black community. Chatham was one of the few African-American communities that when it turned over, it was as middle class as it was when it was white, as it was in the black, and there was a concentration of wealth. The millionaire next door were in Chatham, and they bankrolled the civil rights movement in the South. So he came here not only to protest, but also to pick up some checks so he can continue to do the good work. And so we have the Johnsons represent some of the black leadership. Who's a great person to talk about this is John Rogers from Ariel Capital. He's an investment banker and has researched the history of how the black industrial, the magazines, the movies, the banks, the insurance companies underwrote the civil rights movement. So we have that. The other I want to talk about is our Land Ends founder, Gary Comer. He also was from Greater Grand Crossing, and he has given much money to support the area that's called the Pocket, which is right immediately south of the Oakwood Cemetery, from 71st Street to 75th Street, from South Chicago to the Metro lines. He's built a grammar school, a high school, urban farm, and so he's been a wonderful kind of philanthropic community. The last person I want to highlight is Eugene Sawyer, who was one of the mayors when Harold Washington died. Eugene Sawyer, who was from our community, was an alderman, was the mayor for the year. So that is kind of, I want to say, our brief overview of our Greater Chatham history. I will close with one of our more infamous residents, which is Al Capone, who lived at 77th and Prairie. He lived there until he was convicted of tax evasion. But one of the things that is a little known fact about Al Capone is that he, what did he do with all that bootleg liquor? He had nightclubs, and he was the first person to have integrated nightclubs in Chicago. And so there was a small heart in Al Capone about making sure that the African Americans that he supported through jazz got their fair share of the pie. And with that, I want to close that. What we do at the Greater Chatham Initiative is promote the economic development of our organization. And so we are one of the, because of the change in industrial jobs, that we are no longer a middle-class community, we're a working-class community, but we have attracted people through the area. Our houses are affordable. We still have really great high-quality schools. We have great industry that lives side by side from us. We have over 3,500 businesses that employ 51,000 people. We have 4 industrial segments that are in our community. We have a transportation, distribution, logistic cluster that employs comprised of about 110 companies that have about $100 million in annual sales. We have metal fabrication. They make these door frames and windows, and there's about 10 firms that also do about $120 million in annual sales. We are the breadbasket of the South Side for people who live on the South Side. After downtown, Chatham is where people shop. We have about 300 retail firms that do about $240 million in annual sales. The Federal Reserve Bank says, based on place-based assets, that we are probably the richest African American community in the United States. So you have that kind of juxtaposition of the businesses that are there and the working class folks that are there. Unfortunately, we don't have the stuff that kind of ties them together. We don't have third places. We don't have country clubs, coffee houses, where the people who are in industry can kind of rub shoulders with those people who are here. And so my job is to break down those silos and to bring people together because, again, we have great assets. One of the things that I love about my community are the people. We have tremendous bench strength. People are well-educated. They're engaged, they're knowledgeable, they're passionate about their community, and I'm passionate about it as well. So I thank you for listening to my brief talk about Greater Chatham. Thank you.